Go ahead.
All right. Babujugi noa. Minoa shtika kshishig. Hello to all of you and good evening. Can you get you down again because magazine do din. Get you on a gaming. Minoa wishpia kang unjiba. I introduced myself in my traditional language and in a traditional way. So good evening to everybody. And this is a presentation about beginning to understand racism. I'm a core trainer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. I went to my first workshop in 1987 in Little Falls, Minnesota. I was doing some community organizing on one of our other homelands called White Earth. And a couple of friends of mine brought a brochure to me, and so I went to the workshop, and it was really really opened my eyes to understanding racism. I had never heard an analysis like that before in my life. And it really helped me, some of the pieces that were done kind of helped me heal and understand a lot of the things that I had experienced all my life being in the United States, being called an American Indian, and a lot of the negative experience that I had had. Really helped me understand what had happened to me and what had happened to our people, and really what had happened to a lot of people here in the United States due to racism. So one of the things that I think brought a lot of attention, not only was it when Barack Obama got elected president, I think racism came up, rose up, and then when Black Lives Matter started, I think here in Cook County, because I remember coming back from Duluth one time, and people were protesting on the street, and I honked my horn, and I thought that, all right, people are beginning to talk about it and care about what's happening. And so some people at the Joint Powers meeting began talking about it. And so it was then that they were looking for somebody to kind of give an introduction. The People's Institute does a 2.5-day workshop, and some of you out there might have attended that workshop over the years that we held in Grand Portage and here in Grand Marais. We haven't had one for a number of years. But now that the pandemic has set, the workshop stopped for months, but they've now created the workshop process going on Zoom, and so they can be done that way. And I guess my hope after tonight is people began to talk about it and maybe coordinate to try and get a workshop here in Cook County again. At least that's my hope. And tonight I'm just going to give you an introduction, and I'm going to use some of the pieces in the 2.5-day workshop to kind of give you a little foundation and a basic understanding of what the workshop process presents, and the information and the analysis that the People's Institute has developed over the last 40 years. It's called Undoing Racism / Community Organizing. Well, we'll talk on that about community organizing and how can we organize within institutions and systems to deal or undo racism. And so tonight, I'll share a few ideas and pieces that kind of give us an introduction and a basic understanding. It's not the whole workshop process that gives you a more clear and broader, wider understanding of racism, but I just want to share a few pieces tonight to give people some things to think about and process and hope that they want to learn more. And there are some references or bibliographies that also we have that we can share, different books that have been used by the Institute to develop the analysis that I'm going to share with you tonight. So racism, it's been around a long time here in the United States, hundreds of years. And people wonder, why haven't we effectively dealt with it? Not that people aren't dealing with it and experiencing it, but analysis I'm going to share tonight, I think we call it a working definition that I'm going to share with you. A definition that we can all buy into or not buy into, or at least understand, and use that to begin to understand how we can undo racism. it's the premise of the People's Institute that you can't undo anything unless you understand what was done. And so tonight I'm going to share a little bit of history and a few processes that help us begin to understand what was done. And not only people of color, but how people who are called white in the United States also have been affected by racism. And why I introduced myself in our traditional language and my language is because one of the things that racism has done here in the United States, it's almost destroyed various cultures of peoples who have come here. And so it's important that we really retain our culture, and by culture I basically mean our way of life. That there's ways of life that have been dealt with by racism and almost destroyed. So racism, it's, tonight you're going to hear some things maybe that you never heard before, an analysis that you begin to maybe even question. What we're going to do is we're going to start out with an exercise. And some of you have probably some of you have been through the workshop process before, so this will almost be like a refresher course. But to understand racism, we really have to open up our minds. We've learned a lot of things in our life, but sometimes we question some of the things. Not that we want to disrespect our parents or grandparents or some of the things that they taught us, but there are things that they learned that maybe weren't quite correct and truthful. And so we have to really take a look at that and analyze that and sometimes question that. So we really got to open up our minds tonight and be open to hearing new things and possibly seeing racism in a different light than we've ever seen it before. So we're going to start out with something we call the dot exercise. And as you can see, I got 9 dots up here. And what I'd like those viewing tonight is just take out a piece of paper, a pen or a pencil, and what you'd like you to do is connect all 9 dots using 4 straight lines without removing your pen or pencil off the paper. Again, connect all 9 dots using 4 straight lines without lifting your pen or pencil off the paper. And we'll give people a few minutes. And if anybody gets it or solves it, just call in your chat, and Pam will tell me that people have gotten it. So we'll give you a few minutes to try and connect all 9 dots using 4 straight lines without lifting your pen or pencil off the paper. So how are we doing? Has anybody got
Got 58 people.
that have gotten it?
No, we have 58 people.
Oh,
But he's got it.
so we've done this exercise, and we do it in a workshop. We start out a workshop with this exercise. And if you're having a hard time getting it, don't feel bad, because I've been in workshops with doctors, lawyers, judges, PhD professors. They had a hard time getting it too. So don't feel bad if you're really struggling with trying to solve that. 4 straight lines, you connect all 9 dots using 4 straight lines.
Some are saying, I just can't do it.
Okay. Okay, great. So I will show you. So did anybody come close? You kind of see what I did? What are some ways that you thought prevented you from solving this? Did anybody see a box?
Someone said I saw it as a square, not a triangle. Dave Mills says boundaries.
So a square, in other words, they seen
That was Molly, yep.
it as a box. So you see what I had to do I had to go outside. Because one thing we got to understand about racism is how that's kind of boxed in our thinking. There's what we call the socialization process and conditioning process that takes place in this country. And a lot of people in a workshop process said, well, they were trying to solve it within these 9 dots. Because they saw a box, not just 9 dots, but they saw a box. And so we have to talk about that. What's the conditioning and the socializing that teaches us that when we look at this, we think of a box? There are certain ways, and one of the things that's important, not only does that kind of condition us and keep our thinking, what we call a box thinking, but what's more important is not as individuals, as our communities, but how do you think systems and institutions think in a box about how they operate? Social services, how they give services, judicial systems, how they hand out justice, different institutions and systems, how they operate and give service. So there's different ways that even systems and institutions can be boxed in. Many times we hear that, well, we got policies. That's how we operate. Somebody sets policies. Somebody above, whether it be a board or a board of directors, they set policies for organizations and systems. And then, of course, to function, we need resources. Money. So, well, we'd like to do things a little different, but we don't quite have the resources, enough resources. And one of the things that really keeps institutions and systems in the box is their structure. It's important to understand that the structure probably has never changed since a system and institution was created. So we got structure, resources, policies. And what other thing might be able to keep a system or an institution in a box? Time. Well, you know, the people who are working, not the people setting the policies, but the workers, they say, well, if we had more money, I could do a better job. I feel I could do a better job to serve the communities. I think if the policies changed a little bit, maybe we might be able to be more effective. Certainly, the structure's been this way for a long time, but maybe we need to take a look at the structure. We don't got enough time. You know, we only got 8 hours in a day. So these are kind of things that keep even systems and institutions operating and almost in a box thinking mode. Not only does it keep us, because remember when we were real young, we were told, obey the law. There are certain things that teach us that we have to think. We can't go outside. Many times there are people that say, well, I can't function in here. So we call some people activists. Activists try and get out of that box thinking. They try and think a little different. they say, I can't, this is controlling my way of thinking and operating. So we have people that are called activists. Maybe some of you people out there are activists. Well, what we say is that even activists, there's going to be something that's going to try and put those people back into that box. As hard as we try, and so we say that many times activism, we get to the peripheral of the box. Because when we get out of that box, something puts us back in, and I think an example is like, maybe you remember the Jack-in-a-Box, the little toy, you wind it up, and I don't know, I think even the song is Pop Goes the Weasel, you wind it up and all of a sudden Jack pops out. And so what we do is, what do? We put Jack back in the box. And this is what happens to us within American society, is that we're conditioned and socialized to stay within that box, and if we come out of that and try to come out of that box, there are certain powers that we're going to talk about in a little bit that kind of keep us back into that box thinking. Are there any questions about this exercise? If you can, just if you got a question, just give it, and Pam will relay that question to me. What we're going to talk about now is...
So Molly has the question, how do we know we're stuck in the box?
Because you couldn't connect all 9 dots using 4 straight lines without lifting your pen or pencil off the paper. That tells me that you... Did anybody, Molly, did you go outside of these 9 dots? Or did you try to go outside these 9 dots? Is she thinking about it?
No.
Okay, so that's kind of the answer to your question. It's about conditioning and socializing us here in the United States. That this is what maybe sometimes prevents us to effectively deal with racism. Because this keeps us really conditioned in thinking in certain ways. That we, and these are things that don't happen to us. Let's say when we're a kindergartner, if we asked them to do this, do you think they would stay in the 9 dots? Or even a 4-year-old? Remember when we were children, there was always, what did we do when we had a piece of paper and we had to color something? What were we told? Stay within the lines. Stay within the paper. But by the time a 4-year-old, if we asked them to do this, they'd be all over. Remember, many times when we were young, our children would bring home those papers, and they're not staying inside the box. But there is a certain time in our life as we start the educational system is probably one of the main systems that we're going to talk about. That kind of conditions us and socializes us to stay within that box thinking. So that's what we're talking about. So there's something happening within institutions and system. There's a power outside of us that is taking place that ensures that we stay within this box. And so one of our co-founders, a man by the name of Ron Chisholm, who was a community organizer in the New Orleans area for many years, through the 40s, 50s, and 60s, was told by the community, Ron, you're doing really good as an organizer, but we think you should get more training. And so, Ron said, okay. So he went off to various institutes to community organize. In fact, one of them was Saul Alinsky, the Northwest Academy in Chicago, which was founded by Saul Alinsky, who considered the grandfather of community organizing. And he learned something at one of the workshops he was at, seminars. He learned about something called a power analysis. And so he thought that it was pretty deep. He said, well, I'm going to go back into my community and I'm going to do that on some of our brothers and sisters in the community. So one day he walked up to some brothers and sisters hanging out on the street. And he walked up to them and said, good morning. He said, I'd like to do a power analysis on you. Well, some of the responses he said that he heard were, they pretty much told him he can take that power analysis and stick it. So he thought, wow, maybe that's not how you approach this. So he came back a week later, found some more brothers on the street, and he said, hey, how's it going? And the brother said, well, trying to hang in there, trying to survive, and I'm getting my butt kicked every day. And based on his learning of the power analysis, he said, wow, that's a power analysis. And so he said, and so out of that, they developed what was called the power analysis within the Institute and the 2.5-day workshop process. So if I was to ask you, who lives in the ghetto in the United States now, in 2020, what group of people live in the ghetto? Based on a racial classification. Anybody? What group of folks live in the ghetto today? When you hear that term, what racial group do you think of, comes to mind? No responses?
There's like a 10-second delay.
Huh?
There's like a 10-second delay.
Oh, okay.
Black folks.
All right, black folks. Where do people who have been given the racial classification Hispanic Latino, where do they live? What is their community called?
The barrio.
The barrio. How about American Indians? Where do we live? What are those communities called? Yes, reservations. How about people who have been given the racial classification Asian American? What do they call those communities where they live?
Chinatown.
Very good. Chinatown. Thank you. When we think about these communities, when we hear them, do we think in a positive term? Do we think positive about these communities? Or do we think automatically negative about these communities? Any negatives or positives?
Depends on who you are. These terms have negative associations.
Exactly,
These
okay.
communities have a negative image, a lot of disparities.
Thank you, yes. Now, usually these communities are considered poor communities. So my question, these basically are communities of who we will call tonight people of color. So where do, and usually we think of these communities as poor communities. So where do poor white people live?
Trailer parks.
Trailer park. So some of us have done, so these are
Also the other side of the tracks.
the other side of the tracks, yes. In fact, there's the town up on a Leech Lake, one of our homelands called Leech Lake. There's a town called Cass Lake. And there is a railroad track that goes through Cass Lake. And historically, Native people lived on one side of the tracks and white folks lived on the other side. So that's a very good, very good image that we hear all the time. So many times, so these are negative terms. So many times, many of us write proposals to get money for our system, our organization. So if these are negative terms, we're not going to use them. We're not going to say, maybe write a proposal, like in Minneapolis, in the African American community, write a proposal that we want $50,000 to help those black kids in the ghetto, because that's negative. And if we're writing to either state or federal government proposal, or we're writing to a philanthropy organization, we don't want to use those negative words. So what other kind of terms do we use that sound a little bit more politically correct? If any of you have ever written a proposal out there, what other terms have you used?
Urban?
Okay.
Disadvantaged communities, the
Yes.
neighborhood.
Sometimes we hear underprivileged,
Underserved.
underserved, at risk. So these are terms that they might seem more politically correct, but they also have negative connotations to them. They're still not referring to the community in really a positive light. So when I talked about the analysis that Ron Chisholm began to develop within the Institute, and people said, I'm trying to survive, trying to hang in there, and I'm getting my butt kicked every day. So that's what we call a power analysis. So what we're going to do is take a look at that. First of all, sometimes trainers are in the city, around the country, and some of the people in the workshop come from places that are called the ghetto, the barrio, the reservation, Chinatown. And so we asked, well, geez, maybe tonight after the workshop is done for the day, would you take us to the ghetto? Would you take us to the barrio? And we know that driving down the street, we're not going to see a sign, 5 blocks to the ghetto, 10 blocks to the barrio. We're not going to see them signs. So if we're entering a community called a ghetto, a barrio, a reservation, many times, what are some tangible things that we see? If there's no sign telling us we're entering the ghetto, what are some tangible, visible signs that we see that now tell us we're entering the ghetto, the barrio, the reservation, or Chinatown?
Broken windows.
What's that?
Broken windows, broken down cars. Homes in disrepair.
Okay, and here we got a row of homes, and usually, are these houses owned by people? Well, usually they're rental units. There's very few in these communities where people actually, sometimes majority own the home. A lot of times you'll see signs on stores, rent to own, in communities like that. And there's something in the in law, and Molly must know this, called usury. It's supposed to be illegal. But I'll tell you what, one time my sister went to one of them, and I came to visit her, and boy, she had this nice stereo in the living room. I said, oh wow, where'd you get that? She said, oh, I got it on credit. And I said, yeah. I said, really, where? And she told me this one store, and it was one of those stores rent to own. And so I looked at, I said, well, let me see your purchase order. And I looked at that paper, and I think it was something like 18% interest that she had to pay. And I began to add up her payments, and I said, and it was my sister Lisa, I said, Lisa, by the time you pay off this stereo, you could have bought two. That's how much money you're paying for the stereo. So we see these types of things in these communities. We cash checks, and those are very high interest rates. Of course, many times there are police stations in many urban areas right in the center of some of these communities, which identifies it as Martin Luther King Boulevard or Cesar Chavez Boulevard. We'll see these types of street signs that really, and what they're doing is they're marking these communities, and that people driving will know that they're entering one of these communities, and they might just go around it. And many times we see a freeway system also. Some even going over and right over these communities, and some of them going right through these communities. And historically, we don't have time, but there's a lot of history to that, of the highway systems, how they were developed. Many times you can only see one way into these communities and one way out. So what you see is that they're really looking at this community and making sure that they got a check on it. Because there's some negative things going on in these communities, right? So as Ron said, people said, we're getting our butts kicked. We're getting our butts kicked. And so what we're going to do as part of our power analysis is we're going to look at systems and institutions that have a relationship to a ghetto, a barrio, a reservation, Chinatown, trailer court, that these communities have to deal with every day of their life. And so if these communities are really not looking at these, or as systems and institutions like the insurance system, the employment or unemployment system, the media system is really important of how are these communities viewed, or what images are of these communities that we see on TV or in the movies. The judicial system, how does this judicial system deal with communities like this? Do they deal with communities in the ghetto like they deal with some of the suburban communities, like in Minneapolis, Edina, Minnetonka, or do they deal with only a certain way with communities like in South Minneapolis, where a lot of African American people and Native people live? Healthcare system. How do they operate, and how do they deal, and what kind of relationship, a positive relationship or a negative relationship with these communities? The educational system. How much money do communities like this get to educate their children? Is it equitable? Because one of the things that came out of the discussions that the Joint Powers meeting had and other people is racial inequity. So what we're going to look at tonight is what is that inequity that's taking place based on communities that have a racial classification. Religious. Also, many times we see churches in these communities, front store churches. So these are things, and so what we do is we call this analysis a foot ID. We've just identified the feet that are kicking people's butts in these communities every day. So that, and it's like these systems just don't operate one at a time. These systems operate almost in a tandem. They work together. They're well organized. And so that when at Cook County School here, a child maybe misses too much school, does something disruptive in the school, especially, and so maybe there's a CHIPS petition on the parents and the child. But so they got to deal with the school system. Now they also have to deal with the judicial system. And one thing we didn't put on here that I forgot, a very important one, where is the red? social service system. So now, they're not dealing with one system, they're dealing with at least three. So, and these systems are working together. They're working together, and it's what we're talking about is, and what they become feet of oppression on people because of the way they're dealt with or not dealt with. And so these are the feet, we call them the feet that are kicking people's butts every day. And the way they're operating, like they've been operating since day one. As we talked about, they haven't changed the structure. Many times they haven't changed the policies. We're talking about generations of people. The time factor is still there. And usually many times there's not enough resources to really do the type of service that we want. And so what we say is, many times, these systems and institutions, for some folks in the United States, based on a racial classification, they become windows of opportunity through the educational system, how they're dealt with by the healthcare system, how they're dealt with by insurance system, because we know that people pay a lot more insurance. Now there's something called redlining that was supposed to be outlawed, but it's still going on. There are some dominoes will not go into these communities. Many services in the community, they don't come into those because remember they're called at-risk communities now. They're not just ghettos and reservations anymore, but now they're underprivileged, they're underserved, and they're at risk. And what they're really saying is that people who aren't living in that community, I think what they're saying is, you're at risk, not just the folks living in this community. And so these are feet that, what we say, are windows of opportunities for those folks who are classified as white, because every institution and system in this country were created by those people who have that racial classification as white. And they were created by those people who are called white for people who are white. Every institution, bar none, in this country was created for them. So that's why we say they become windows of opportunities for those people who they were created for in the United States. And they're working the way they're supposed to for people called white. And how do we know that? We all read the statistics that come out every year based on racial classifications and who then has the best outcomes. What group of people in the United States have the best outcomes from all these institutions? Are people called white. The statistics, they have the best outcomes because of the way they operate and how they serve those certain folks. So that when we talk about people of color, you see those statistics, and in fact Native Americans are usually at the bottom, and you have African Americans, Asian Americans, and you have all these racial, and a lot of times because there's not a lot of us, we're really left out of a lot of statistics in this country. But the statistics tell us that these systems and institutions are working the way they're supposed to. But for other folks or people of color, they then operate and work in such a way that they become feet of oppression for people living in the ghetto, the barrio, and or communities called disenfranchised, underserved, at risk, target area. Remember that from the 1960s, some of you out there who are old enough to remember when John Kennedy got elected in 1960, and then he started to one of his promises to many of the communities he went into, and they were poor communities like the ghetto, the reservation, the barrio, and he promised that his administration would deal with poverty. And so he started the Office of Economic Opportunity, the OAO programs, and he tried to really deal with poverty. that was going on. So this is a power analysis. It's really important to understand, and we're going to get a little bit further into. So are there any more questions about this? Or any things that you'd like to be clarified, or tell me too if you don't agree with it. It's really important that we.
There was a comment, even census questions can reflect prejudicial propensities.
Yes. Okay, so. Give me a few minutes if there's any more questions or comments.
Who are the feet of oppression?
Systems and institutions and how they relate to these communities. They do not relate, and it's based on racial classifications, African American, Hispanic / Latino, American Indian / Alaskan Native, Asian American. So along with these terms also come racial classifications. And then all of it, what we talk about is stereotypes that come along with these different classified terms that they put on various communities. And so that what we say in our power analysis that every institution and system bar none does not relate to these communities the same way they relate to all white communities. That's what the power analysis. So there's something about power that's not only keeping poverty in place, but keeping racism in place. And we're going to talk about that because now we're going to go into talk about what racism is.
John, you have a question?
Yes.
Where is white supremacy's impact?
That's next. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question now. We're going to talk about racism. We're going to talk about what is racism. So what I'd like is maybe some of you out there did a thesis on racism or you did a paper on it, but tell me a little bit about what is racism, and maybe just use a few words if you can, but what comes to mind when I ask the question, what is racism? And just respond on some definitions that people have of what is racism. And I'll write them down on the paper.
When you are treated differently because you look different from white people.
Yeah.
Judging a person not as an individual but as a member of a
Okay,
collective group.
let me give you that first one first. When you're treated different.
When you're treated differently because you look different from white people.
Because you look different from white people, okay. Okay, another one?
Judging a person not as an individual, but as a member of a collective group.
Judging an individual.
But as a member of a collective group.
Judging an individual. Say that one more time.
Judging a person not as an individual, but
Oh,
as a
judging.
member of a collective group.
Okay, of a person not as an individual, but a member
Of a collective group.
okay, but a member of okay.
Believing there's a difference in people because of the color of their skin.
So much for a few
How
words.
about color?
Color of skin?
Color of skin.
Racism is color of skin, yeah.
Yep.
Trying, yeah,
Stereotyping and prejudice.
okay. Prejudice, okay. Okay. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced this, but has anybody walked up to you and called you a racist?
There's white superiority, inequity.
Okay, white superiority. Inequity? Did you say
Inequity, yep.
inequity? Okay.
Different thoughts and actions based on another group of people's race or culture. So thinking about people differently because of race and culture.
Okay, okay. About people based on their race and culture?
Yep. And then thinking races, certain races are inferior.
So now, what's that next one? What was that last one after? People based on their race and culture, then the next one was?
Believing certain races are inferior to
Oh,
white
okay.
people.
Certain people?
Certain races are inferior to white people.
Certain races are inferior to white people. Okay. So this is our box. We reached the end of the page. So what we call, these are definitions of what people think, what racism is. Is there, and if we're trying to undo racism, with all these different definitions, can we undo racism? It's kind of like thought, how people look different based on, from white people. How we're judging an individual, but a member of a collective group, color of skin, stereotyping and prejudice, white superiority, inequity, thinking about people based on their race and culture, believing certain races are inferior to white people. A lot of different definitions of what we think racism is. It can be, it's basically from this chart, it's like racism is whatever you feel it is. Racism is whatever you think it is. Racism is, so we're all over the page. You really can't take this and undo racism. So within the Institute, we believe that in order to effectively undo racism or deal with racism, that we have to have a common definition. We all have to get on the same page. We're all over here, stereotyping, color of skin. We're all thinking a little bit different about what racism is. So I'm going to share with you the definition that the People's Institute uses. Now, this is a definition that isn't something that the Institute developed. In fact, in the middle 70s, the National Education Association, if some of you are familiar, used prejudice plus power equals racism. But what we've done is, what's important to understand about our definition is that we define every word. We want people to understand every word in this definition. And it's almost like a formula. So what does it mean to be prejudiced? When we hear the word prejudice, what does that mean? How do we define prejudice? Oh, okay.
Prejudged opinion.
Yes. Yeah, it basically means to prejudge a situation. And is prejudice always negative?
No.
Oh, when is prejudice not negative? Well, when my daughter was about 2 years old, and a friend of ours brought over some Barney tapes. I don't know, y'all remember Barney, the big purple dinosaur? And so we'd watch them every day. And on there, Barney would tell children, don't take candy from strangers. Don't get in a car of a person you don't know. See, that's a prejudice. That's prejudging a situation. We're trying to teach our children to prejudge situations because it might save their life. So prejudice can be a positive term many times and be a positive experience. But when we put the word race in front of prejudice, now we're talking about a certain specific prejudice called race prejudice. And some of the definitions brought out that earlier. So, what is race? Or how is our race determined here in the United States?
Ethnicity.
Ethnicity?
A social construct.
Okay, I can't write fast,
Okay.
Pam. And then, I'm a good speller, but when you get up here, your mind goes, okay. And okay, what's the other one?
A social construct.
Social construct.
We also have a man-made concept.
What does that mean? What could they tell me a little bit about what they mean by that?
Ask them.
Yeah, could you tell me what you mean by man-made? I just want to know a little bit more about the thought behind that.
As in by society,
Okay. I'll put it up here.
created by society.
Okay. In what other ways is race
Skin color,
skin color? Okay.
looking like a specific group,
Could we say physical features? I'm just, physical features, is that all right with the person that gave that? Yes, is physical features, could I put that up here for your response? I will anyway.
yes.
Okay, what other ways is a person's race qualified or?
Birthplace,
So that would be,
country of origin,
oh, yeah, okay, good.
DNA test,
DNA, okay. How about culture? Put it up there
culture, Diane said it.
anyways. Okay. So, country of origin. So, you're born in Germany, or you're born in Norway, or you're born in France, and you come over here to the United States and become a citizen. Is that why you're called white? Because you weren't white when you were born in Europe. So no, it doesn't matter what your origin was, or even your nationality before you got here. So we're going to eliminate that. How about skin color? Can you really determine a person's race by their skin color? I know a lot of Native people who are Native, but you wouldn't be able to tell them, right? Or African American people. Within generations of people, not all.
It is not always.
Yeah, okay, so let's eliminate skin color. The race here in the United States is not based on. How about ethnicity?
Comment is no.
No, that's right. It's not based on ethnicity. How about DNA test?
No.
No, because as human beings, our DNA, of African American could be have the same DNA as another person. In fact, DNA means we're 99.9% 99.98 DNA all the same. DNA means we both have lungs, we both have a heart, both have arms, ears, legs. That's our DNA, and so our racial classification is not really based on any DNA. How about culture?
I have a question.
Okay.
How do you classify a mixed race person?
Well, you got these forms that we fill out, and they have the various races on there. We have to check a box. And so those people who are based on mixed races, they can only check one box. And so that's kind of a dilemma for people who are of mixed races. And so it forces people to make a choice. You have to make a choice. Which box are you going to check? So a way of life. Are we called American Indians based on our way of life? That we lived for thousands of years before Europeans came here? Is that how we became American Indians? Or people called African Americans who were brought over here to the Virginia colony in 1619, the first 20 Africans. Is African American based on their culture, their way of life? Is that how they got that term? So what we're saying is no, it's not based on culture either. How about physical features? Can you really tell, we talked about it a little bit before, can you really tell a person's race by their physical features?
No.
No, because there could be different people of different races that you really can't tell what they are. Like African Americans, some are really light and some are really dark. Within all various peoples, not all people come out the same color, even with the same parents. But man-made, and yes, we're going to talk about social construct and man-made. These are kind of getting close. And so we're going to give you the definition that was developed by the People's Institute based on some history. So where did race, when did it come about? This concept, when was it developed? How long ago? Because it hasn't been with us from the beginning of time. Even if you go back to the Bible, people are identified by their tribal affiliation, not by where they were born, their physical features, their ethnicity, but they're called by their tribal affiliation. Well, anyways, there's a book that maybe you can try and get. It's called The Fallacy of Race, Man's Most Dangerous Myth. And it's a book written in the late 40s by a man by the name of Ashley Montague. I believe you can probably try and get that on Amazon or some way. But what that particular book does is it goes into that history. Talks about a couple social scientists, a man by the name of Johann Blumenbach, a German social scientist, another man by the name of Georges Leclerc Buffon, a French social scientist, and they worked with another man by the name of Carolus Linnaeus. He was a Swedish botanist. And so what happened is in the middle 1700s, they were given a task, or they started. One thing about Blumenbach, And he will become the father of what is called physical anthropology. And another thing that Blumenbach liked to do is he liked to study skulls. And so a skull was found at an area around what is called Georgia today and brought to him. It was a fairly large skull. And so then he had some other skulls. He got a skull from Africa. He got a skull from what at that time it was called Mongolia. And then he got another skull from Australia, down where the Aborigine people lived. Unfortunately, the other skulls he got weren't as big as the skull from Georgia, and it was a Georgian woman. And so he began to study that. And so Linnaeus then takes some of the research that Blumenbach is doing, and he, not on how he, in botany, how they classify plants and animals, plants, he starts dabbling in beginning to classify the human family. Something I was taught when I was very young by my mother. She taught me not to be prejudiced, race prejudiced. She taught me that what she was taught is we're a human family. The four peoples of the earth were put here. And we all understood the same values and principles. And so she taught me that that's what we are. We might look different, we might talk different, but we're still a family. And so what we're talking about is something, how race was, somebody said man-made. And so Blumenbach will study that, and after studying for a number of years, he still will not be able to say, we might not conclusively, definitively say there are differences of mankind. And so what Blumenbach will do is he'll create, not Linnaeus, but then Blumenbach and Buffon, they will create certain terms to identify people of the earth. Some people out there might have taken a course in anthropology. In fact, Buffon became one of the fathers of creating the social science. And the term social science, we got to keep that in mind. So they will create, and they'll first of all identify 4 different species of humankind. And some of you might recognize these terms. They'll call people from that area Caucasoids. They will call people from today called Asia, and at that time it's called Mongolia. Well, they will identify them people as Mongoloids. And then when they discover the people down in New Zealand, Australia, they will call them people Australoids. And then he gets a skull from Africa, and so they will give those people from Africa a term named Negroids. Okay. And after a while, there will be other terms developed more when they find other people, but these are the basic 4 terms that they put on the human family, the family of man. So with these terms, there's also a color, right? So what's the color for Caucasoids? What is the color we usually associate with that? Please.
White.
Very good, thank you. How about Mongoloids?
Yellow.
Australoids,
Red.
red, or brown. We hear these terms today. How about negroids?
Black.
Black, okay. So now, this is still taught, maybe in an anthropology class in a high school, probably a wealthy high school, well-off high school. It's taught in all the universities and colleges. This is taught in what we call anthropology classes. And anthropology is a social science. Now the key is science, because what is science based on? It's got to be based on fact. It's got to be based on real information. So that the term Caucasoid, where on planet Earth do you think that term came from? How that term was created?
Caucasus region.
Yes, very good. An area called the Caucasus Mountains. And that's a mountain range that divides southeastern Europe and Asia. So that's where that skull, that larger skull from that area, today it's called Georgia, but that's along there. So really the term you can identify with the place on planet Earth. And there's people there. And there's language, there's culture. So, how about Mongoloid? Where would that term come from?
Mongolia.
Mongolia at that time, and today now it's called Asia. So again, Mongoloid, at least there's a place on planet Earth that you can identify with this term, where there's humanity, there's language, there's culture, and then, of course, it's very evident Australoid is from Australia, and they knew about us over here on North and South America, and so that they kind of eventually will put us in with the Australoid identification. What's really interesting is Carolus Linnaeus, he had this thing about how he viewed people from what would be called North and South America. He said that we were prone to anger, that we were people that were prone to anger, either by the middle 1700s, what they were hearing about the native people over here. And so that's the beginning of this whole idea of that we're prone to anger, so if we'll really spurn what we call that, we have to be civilized. Where we don't posture ourselves, we can't control ourselves, we're just angry folks, and so we have to be civilized. How about negroids? Where would that term come from? Or I guess I'd ask the question, where's Negro land?
Africa.
Okay, well, geez, it seems like they should then create the term Afroid. Wouldn't that make more sense? Because Afroid then does talk about a place on planet Earth where people came from. There's language, there's culture. But no, instead they gave the term Negroid. So we have to take a look at the beginning of the word for Caucasus, comes from the Caucasus Mountains, Mongolia, Australia. And I asked, where's Negro land? Well, where does that term come from?
We have Niger River, or Niger River.
Yeah. So, but in the Latin language, what does Niger mean? If are there any classical language people out there? What does the word, because it's a Latin term, Niger.
It's Spanish for black.
Yes. It's a color. It comes from originally the Portuguese and then the Spanish. And the word is negro. And what it does is it means the color black in the Spanish language. So what's going on here? Just by that term, calling a whole group of human beings coming from the continent of Africa Negroids, what does that do? So what was going on at this time in the middle 1700s in the world? What was happening?
Slavery.
Well, yes.
Colonialism.
We kind of have to go back to what we call a papal bull that was issued by Nicholas V in 1451. And what that particular papal bull, and the papal bull is issued by the Pope at that time, because that was the Christian church in the world. It was based out of Rome and the Pope. And so in 1451, Nicholas V will authorize or give blessings and permission for King Alfonso of Spain to allow people to go out and begin exploring the world. And it sets a tone of setting a standard of spirituality in the world. And that basically the papal bull says if you find other people and they're not Christian, then there's a question whether they're really human beings or not. And so what this will also do is allow Portugal to go to the west coast of Africa and not only using African people who they pay, but going in there and stealing, kidnapping human beings from their homeland. We learn in history, they call it the slave trade or the transatlantic. But I like to call it what it was. It's the beginning of a problem that still exists in the world today. It's called human trafficking. How many of our native women are being kidnapped and stolen from Canada and the United States and other people, Hispanic people, and sold. And that's what's unique about this is that what will happen is it'll be called a peculiar institution, because what is happening is it's different from any other slavery that's ever occurred in the history of mankind. It is now a type that is based on currency and the lucrative trade of money, gold and silver. And so if all of these European countries, and then of course in 1493, a papal bull will be issued by Alexander VI and also give them Spain that blessing to go off and colonize the areas of the world. And if you find people that are not Christian, then you can take possession of their land, you can put the people in perpetual slavery. So there's a mindset that's beginning to be developed in the late 1400s. So what they basically have to do to justify that lucrative activity in money-making business, in order to justify it, they have to take the humanity of those people who are being stolen from their homeland, brought to the various island systems that are being colonized by European nations, and eventually brought here to the United States in 1619, where the Dutch sell the first 20, as they call nagars in Dutch, to the Virginia colony in 1619. So what this does, what we're saying is race can't be based on fact. You can't prove, because this is the illogic part of it. These other three classifications, there's at least humanity, but here they've literally, by this term, Negroids, and in fact, Negro, they took it out of the dictionary for a while, but believe it or not, it's going to be back in the dictionary. They've taken away the humanity of these people. So these people aren't even seen as human beings. And then, of course, when people come over here, then because we aren't Christian people, we aren't seen as human beings at all. So what you're beginning to see historically, a mindset that's being developed about certain people, certain human beings. So based on that history, one of the things that kind of spurred in this presentation was something called racial inequality. So let's go back a little bit in history about this concept called race and how those people from Africa that were brought here to the Virginia colony were treated. What happens is they were initially brought here and they were like indentured servants, just like the Irish, the Dutch, the Scottish, the poor of Europe that were brought here to do the work in the colonies and on the plantations. The poor of Europe. And then when they bring in the first Africans to the Virginia colony in 1619, they're working side to side together. They're both doing the same hard work for the plantation and the colony. If they don't do their work hard, they both get whipped the same. What they will call them the Negroes and the European indentured servants. They all get harsh treatment the same way. They don't get fed well. They don't get housed well. So what happens is they're not seeing things like color. They're developing human relationships. They're all in the same situation. And so what happens is they get together and they run away. They say, I can't take this anymore. And so they'll come together, European indentured servants and Negroes, run away. Well, what happens is they send out bounty hunters, and they get caught. And so there's a case in 1640 in the colony of Virginia. Now, there's a book by, it's called In the Matter of Color, Race and the American Legal Process, the Colonial Period. And it was written by a man by the name of A. Leon Higginbotham, Jr. He was an African-American man. And eventually, he just died maybe about 4 or 5 years ago. And eventually, he became a federal judge. But he was going to school at Purdue University in 1947. He and some other African-American students. Now, Purdue, that's in the north, right? And of course, in the south, they have Jim Crow laws of segregation, legal segregation based on a court case in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson. If y'all remember, that's the equal but separate. A law that allows us to separate each other based on race. And so there's a case called the John Punch case in 1640. And in Re-Negro John Punch, 3 runaway, so Higginbotham are students, but they're put in the back dormitories of Purdue University, and they're not very good dormitory accommodations. And so one day he says, wait a minute. He says, we pay the same tuition as the white students. And why do they get better living accommodations than us? Why do we have to sit back here in the back of Purdue in these run-down dormitory conditions. And so we actually went to the president of Purdue and lodged his complaint and asked this question. And eventually he left Purdue University. He was run out of Purdue University. And so I'm sure he understood Plessy versus Ferguson, and he understood the Jim Crow laws of the South, but he's in the north of the United States. There are no Jim Crow laws there, but there's still segregation. And so he tried to figure, what's that all about? What's the history of that? And so what he did is he went back and he began to study the various statutes at that time of the 13 colonies and the various statutes that were being passed. And so he'll find a case in 1640 where 3 indentured servants, a man by the name of John, I'll read it to you. In re Negro John Punch, 3 runaway servants, 2 white and 1 black, John Punch, were captured in Maryland and each sentenced to be whipped. But the judicial parity stopped with the whipping. The court then went on to impose different sentences for the same crime. One called Victor, a Dutchman, the other a Scotchman called James Gregory, shall first serve out their times with their master according to their indentures, which was 7 years, and 1 year apiece after the time of their service is expired. So now they got another year added on to their indentureship. So now they have to serve 8 years. And after that service, to serve the colony for 3 whole years apiece. So now they basically got they don't have to serve the plantation, but they have to serve the colony on a whole. So their indentureship is now 11 years. And that the third, being a Negro named John Punch, shall serve his said master or his assigned for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. What are they saying there? The Negro now gets life. He just doesn't get stuff added onto him, but he has to serve his master for life. That's in 1640. We call that disparity in sentencing for the same crime. What is that, 400, almost 300, 380 years ago? Is that still happening? Or people based on their racial classification, is there still today a sentencing disparity or inequality of how justice is served in this country? Yes. So we got to go back to history to find what's the roots of this. Well, people still kept running away with each other. Even after that, Negroes and European indentured servants still formed those natural alliances, and they'd run away together. So they call it, and so 20 years later, in 1660, there'll be another statute passed in the Virginia colony to try and deal with that. And so in 1660, a statute dealt with one of the early attempts of the legislature to put a stop to such attempts. In other words, forming those natural alliances of a Negro and European indentures, and they're still running away together. And so what the statute will say is that 1660 Act 22, it is enacted that in case any English servant shall run away in company with any Negroes who are incapable of making satisfaction by addition of time, that the English so running away shall serve for the time of the Negroes' absence, as they are to do for their own by a former act. So
Back up a little by the microphone.
Sorry. So what are they saying there? They're saying if you're a European indentured servant, if you're Dutch, Scottish, Irish, and you continue to form these natural relationships with those people called Negroes, that if you run away with one and the Negro isn't caught and you're caught, and you come back to the colony, that you now have to serve out the time of the Negro until they're caught. And what is that? Life. Now, do you think that would discourage folks from Europe or those indentured servants in the colonies to continue to form those natural relationships and run away together? Again, what what Higginbotham is seeing is the roots of this concept by law of separating, keeping people separate from coming together. So what we have to take a look at that is the history of how segregation, or that mindset of segregation, came about. Misogyny. People of different races marrying each other. If you all remember, when it begins back in the colonies. So anyways, we're talking about the term, so we got, say, 1675, 76. We all learn about this in history. We call it Bacon's Rebellion, right? Nathaniel Bacon, he was an overseer working for, in fact, his cousin was William Berkeley, who was the governor of the colony of Virginia. And Nathaniel, he had a Harvard degree. He was an educated Englishman. And how he was given a job as an overseer, looking at the indentured servants and making sure they're doing the work. And he wanted to get a little bit better piece of the pie. And thinking that his cousin was related to him, he went to him and said, I'd like to, I got a good education here, Bill. Why don't you give me a better job? And of course, his cousin, who kind of had all the power, said, nah. He said, you're doing a good job what you're doing. You just keep doing what you're doing. So Nathaniel kind of got angry. And so he started a rebellion. He got all the indentured servants, whatever Indians were there that they could capture and keep in the colony. And they went out, and the idea was that they were going to go out and do the bidding of the colony by going out and killing certain people. And who was that? Those were the native people. So he went out and did some massacring, trying to get the pleasure of William Berkeley. And he came back, and still he didn't get a better job, and so he formed a rebellion. In fact, they burnt Jamestown to the ground in 1676. In fact, Berkeley had to go out into the waters on a ship and wait for the reinforcements to come from England. And when they got there, they squelched the rebellion. It was quite large. He had hundreds and hundreds of people that he had organized, and so Nathaniel was an organizer. But 3 months later, Nathaniel Bacon died. And so in the Institute we say he was an organizer, but if he had attended an undoing workshop, he would have known something about developing leadership development. So that after he died, if he developed those people he was organizing, they could have continued the rebellion, but the rebellion was squashed. And so in the colonies, when an indenture servant finished their indentureship, which was 7 years or whatever years might have been added on, depending if they tried to run away from the colony, what were they given in the 1600s? Nothing. They served out their indentureship, but they had nothing. They didn't have no land. So basically, they had to continue working for a master on a plantation, or they had to continue working for the colony. They were still in service. And so even after Bacon's rebellion, they still kept developing natural relationships and running away together. And so We have to deal with that. And so they created another statute. Okay. So in 1691, this is something like less than 20 years after Bacon's Rebellion. But Blumenbach found out in his research that the subsequent 1691 statute, Act 16, was far more comprehensive, talking about how we're going to deal with these indentured servants still running away. By the language of its preamble, it was designed to prevent that abominable mixture and spurious issue by Negroes, mulattoes, and Indians intermarrying with English or other white women, and provided that whoever English, of course, they kept their identity for themselves because they were in control, whatsoever English or other white man or woman. Okay, now this is the first time we're hearing a term white man or white woman. Never heard that before. That was never in any statute or any mindset in the world at that time. So they, bond or free, shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman, bond or free, he shall within 3 months be banished from this dominion forever. Well, that's a pretty harsh law that ensures that you keep mixing, you start marrying that Indian or that Negro or that mulatto, that's it. You're gone. You're kicked out, you're banished. You're banished forever. Get out of here. Quit doing that. That's not what this is all about. These colonies are just for certain folks. Not for Negroes, not for Indians, not for mulattoes. But we're creating this new country, these new colonies for just certain folks. And so gives us an understanding of where that mindset, how we begin to be separated. Not just separated in thought, but now separated in law. So what we say is that race has become a legal term in the United States. Well, guess what? All of a sudden, indentured servants are finished their indentured service and starting to say, hey, wait, what about us? What do we get for serving 7+ some years? And we've done our indentureship, we've paid back the passage and the people who brought us over here. What do we get? We want a piece of the pie. And so, in 1705, some 13 years later, there'll be something created called freedom dues. In other words, when an indentured servant became a free person after serving out their indentureship, they were going to get something. And so, additionally, the law required the payment of freedom dues, payable at the end of the indenture, for those servants who did not receive a yearly wage. And this is what the statute said, that there shall be paid and allowed to every imported servant not having yearly wages at the time of service ended by the master or owner of such servant, to every male servant 10 bushels of Indian corn, 30 shillings in money, or the value thereof in goods, and 1 well-fixed musket, or fusee, of the value of 20 shillings at least. And to every woman servant, 15 bushels of Indian corn, and 40 shillings in money, and the value thereof in goods. No gun. Just the men got the gun. So those were the free. Now is to give indentured servants incentive to stay and do the work. And because many indentured servants, after a while, they said, I can't take this anymore. Send me back to Europe. I want to go back home. I thought it would be a little bit better over here. And so what I call those freedom dues, or what the Institute calls those freedom dues, is we say that was the beginning of what is called today affirmative action. That where certain folks get compensation, get the goodies. Different from what we talk about, and we'll talk about affirmative action a little later and what that really is all about today. But there's a history to a lot of things. So based on that history, the Institute has developed our own definition of race. So we'll define race. I think there's an O in here. Race is a specious classification of human beings. And we go back to the Caucasoids, Mongoloids, created by Europeans, Blumenbach, Buffon, Linnaeus, who eventually would be, when they get over here to the United States, would be called white. So created by Europeans, or whites in parentheses, which assigns social status and human worth, using white as the model of humanity and the height of human achievement. So all of us went through the educational system here in the United States, and who gets all the credit for science, for math, everything? Who gets all, where are we led to believe that all of those things that were developed came from where? They came from Europe. Bar none, all of the curriculum that we learned. And so there's a mindset, and we talked about that big skull that Blumenbach was brought to Blumenbach, bigger than the other skulls. Even back then there was an implicit thinking that bigger skull, therefore a bigger brain cavity, therefore a bigger brain, therefore people from Europe are superior to everybody else in the world. Something that race is keeping in place. Human achievement. Why? For the purpose of establishing and maintaining power and privilege. And that every institution and system created here in the United States has a bias built into it as it's being created. Through history, we understand that, the mindset of how history was developing in the colonies, and then when the United States became a nation. And so that's why we see every system and institution relate to certain communities called ghetto, barrio, reservation, Chinatown. And what do they call the folks in the trailer court? What do they call people living in the trailer court here in the United States? Somebody's got to know it.
Trailer trash.
Trailer trash. Oh my goodness. What they're saying, everything was set up for you. All these institutions and systems, and you still can't make it? So what we're saying is that these windows of opportunity, they're not all handed out at the same degree, because there's a social, economic class system in this country. And what we're saying is that racism keeps this race-class system in place by all these institutions and systems, by the way they relate to these communities, and how they, as some people call racism, stereotypes going. See, I remember the media, motion picture industry. I was sharing with Pam before we started. First time that I really experienced something that really traumatized me as a young 6-year-old. And because there were just 4 of us Indian families living in this very part of South Minneapolis, and the rest of the neighborhood was white, everybody knew where the Indians lived. We all lived in a 4-plex, 4 Indian families. And so people knew also saw the kids that lived there. So one day, I was riding my bike down the sidewalk. I had just gotten a new bike. I was 6 years old. And just before I got to the end of the block, there was a mom and pop store. And so just as I got close to the end of the block, an older white woman walked out of the mom and pop store with a bag of groceries. As soon as I seen her, I hit the brakes. And I came probably about 20 feet from her. But I scared her, and she dropped her groceries. And she turned to me with, in the meanest voice, I still can hear her today. This is how traumatic it was. She turned to me and said, "Why don't you watch where you're going, you dirty little Indian savage?" Wow, so, you know, I knew she wasn't talking to me positive, so I just turned my bike around and walked back to where we were living, went upstairs into our apartment, went in the living room and sat on the couch, kind of like just feeling really bad, you know. My mom walked in and knew something was wrong. She says, "What's wrong?" So I told her what that woman said to me. And she said, no, we're not that, no. And she wouldn't teach me the language because of her trauma of boarding schools and being made fun of because her speaking more Anishinaabe Morrin than English. Even though she was learning English in a boarding school, she'd come home every summer, and of course our people living in Chippewa City talked the language and still talked Anishinaabe Morrin. So she said, "You're a Chippewa. Never forget that. Be proud of that. We're a good people." And she began teaching me some of our traditional ways that my grandmother had taught her. And she said, you know, we're respectful people, we're loving people, we're sharing people. You see somebody that needs something, we go over and help them. That's the way we are. That's who you are. And I said, well, why do kids call me names and why do they look at us like that? And she said, because they don't know us. She said if they got to know us, they wouldn't talk about us or treat us that way. If they got to know us, they'd know we're good people. So she's trying to really instill a proud identity, even with these negative things I'm experiencing out in the neighborhood and around South Minneapolis. So she's trying to make sure that that doesn't put me down, that doesn't take me down as a human being. She's trying to instill pride. No, we're good people. But I, every Saturday morning, would turn on that TV about 6:30. I'd get up about 6 o'clock every Saturday. By 6:30, I'd eat my bowl of cereal, then I'd go in the living room and turn on the TV that we would have, and I'd see that test pattern. I don't know if many of you remember that test pattern. It was a circle, and in the center it had EBS. And on some of those test patterns, there was an Indian head with a headdress kind of in the corner, and I used to look at that and wonder what that was all about. And then bam, 7 o'clock, the odors would come on, the Westerns that I watched faithfully. So here on one hand, my mom's telling me to be proud of who I am, and then on the other hand, the media or the motion picture industry, I'm watching how they're portraying our people as savages, dumb, warlike. That's the images now I'm receiving. On one hand, I'm receiving positive images from my mother and my father, And on the other hand, I'm watching these Westerns, and all of a sudden I'm receiving a negative image of us as a people. So I'm getting mixed messages now for a young 6, 7-year-old. That can get kind of confusing. I believe my mom. I love my mom. I respect her. I believe what she's teaching me. But then what am I seeing here? How we're being portrayed every Saturday. And that's that motion picture me. That's the system, keeping those stereotypes going. And so we're talking about how, and if this is created by certain folks, for certain folks, how do you establish a system to ensure that people who these institutions and systems were meant for have that access, get those privileges from all these institutions and systems? And how then does the power structure be kept in place? And that's what we call racism. Because when we talk about racism, if we don't understand what race is all about, what does ism do? All ism does is make it a belief system, an ideology. I looked up ideology in the dictionary, the American Heritage College Dictionary, 3rd edition. Ideology, a set of doctrines or beliefs that form the basis of a political, economic, and other system. So when we put an ism on the end of a word, like racism, it says a distinctive doctrine, system, or theory. And that's what it is. It's a theory, yes.
A request to have you read the definition again.
Okay. We define race based on historical fact and historical research. A species, now, species, what does species mean? Not species, but specious. It means fake, it means not true, not real. And that's what we say, race is a specious classification of human beings created by Europeans. We go back to Blumenbach and Buffon and Linnaeus, who when Europeans come over here to the United States, after the United States is created, they become white or / American. Race then assigns social status and human worth. Going back to the papal bulls, that because we weren't Christian, when European nations came over to what was called Turtle Island, that we weren't humans because we weren't Christians. That was the spiritual doctrine set down by the church at that time. And social status. So what social status do people of color have in this country? Do they have the same social status as those people called white? And the way these institutions operate, we say no. So there's even and then they use white as the model of humanity and the height of human achievement, so that in order to keep, where's the Caucasoid? Here we go. In order to keep. Oh, I'm sorry. Huh?
So it's establishing what? And maintaining power and privilege.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah. So that when we look back at, every time they put these oids on when it's taught, who's on top? This is the way the Caucasoid is always on top, and Negroid is always on the bottom, and then everybody else. And so every institution created, or people who would eventually become people called white, first time in 1691, that they have access and privilege. And so power, How do we define power to end our definition of racism? We've defined race. We know what prejudice is. Now we understand race prejudice. Power. So what we say, the definition of power based on our definition of race, power is the legitimate and legal access to those systems and institutions sanctioned by the state. Those systems and institutions sanctioned by law. So race has become a legal term here in the United States. That's why we have to check a box. Now, some white folks will say, well, I don't check white. I put human being. Well, I'll tell you what, either that paper is going to be thrown in a basket or somebody's going to check it for you based on what you look like. This is the power in our power analysis in how they keep the privilege, the access, and the benefits for those people who they were meant for. So I went to the dictionary and looked up how the dictionary defines race. And they will say a local, geographic, or global human population, well, that's an easy three, distinguished as a more or less distinct group by genetically transmitted physical characteristics. Boy, that's based on this, that's confusing. That's crazy. We already said genetically we're all the same, but they're saying genetically are physical characteristics. Okay. 2, a group of people united or classified together on the basis of common history, nationality, or geographic distribution. Human beings considered as a group. Wow. We already defunct a lot of that in these definitions that are in a dictionary that literally still keep people confused about what race is or racism. That now race has become an ideology with the ism on it. Even though they'll say ism is distinct doctrine, system, or theory. So what race is all it is a theory, and so people say, well, then we got to do away with race. Can't have that anymore. Wait a minute, no. Remember, we said all these institutions and systems that those folks who it was meant for or built for, who are called white in the United States, they have the best outcomes. And that people of color, people from the res, the barrio, the ghetto, and even white people don't always get that access and privilege to the same degree, because there's a class system in this country that came out of the colonies and was also built in to the United States society. Is there any more questions or any clarification that people would like? So what we call the United States of America, we called it a race construct society. Racism is built into the United States Constitution. March 26th, 1790 was one of the first laws that was passed by the new United States government. Chapter 3, an act to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Section 1, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America in Congress assembled, that any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. So we say that's how race or racism was brought into the Constitution. By one of the first laws, they made sure that whatever system and institution they created, that only citizens who were what? a free white person would have that legitimate and legal access to these systems that were sanctioned by law. We only know of 2 other countries that have put race into their constitutions. We've done a lot of research trying to find more countries, but we can only find 2 other countries after the United States did that. Can anybody tell me what other 2 countries have race within their constitutions? Or had one kind of. You know, it's history. That's another thing, how they teach history in the United States. We say that it's taught in an ahistorical way. Because I remember when I was a kid, I'll tell you a story. So has anybody come up with the other 2 countries yet? Okay. Well, South Africa, with apartheid in 1948, how they, over here, the United States government created reservations where we were kept. In South Africa, they created the Bantustans. Reservations, Bantustans. We had to get permission to leave the reservation from the Indian agent. Well, if we got caught outside the reservation, we could get killed legally. Same with apartheid. If blacks had to have permission, South African blacks had to get permission from the South African government to leave the Bantustans. So apartheid, South Africa one, and the other one was Germany, Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. In fact, there's a book by a man by the name of John Toland. He wrote a biography of Adolf Hitler. And in there, Adolf Hitler says he admires the way that the United States has dealt with their red savages. So he takes all of the federal Indian policy, probably looks at Jim Crow laws that are still in the South. And that's what he does. He excludes those people who aren't going to be part of the Aryan race, gypsies, Jews, disabled. All those people are not going to be part of the...
There was a question about Liberia. Would that be a country?
I think it still is, yeah. A country of what?
Would that fall into the same category?
It's not in their constitution. It's not in there. People aren't separated because of race. So what happens when 7th grade, by the time I'm 12 years old, unfortunately, I lost my mother when I was 9, and my dad tried to take care of us, but because we were living, at least at that time, in the cities, social services came in, and so from 10 years old on, me and my 3 sisters were raised in foster homes, and at that time there was no Indian Child Welfare Act, so pretty much couldn't live with any of our relatives. My 2 younger brothers, they were 16 and a half and 2 and a half, and for some reason they were able to stay with one of our grandmothers, and one of our other uncles was placed. So my 2 younger brothers, who were real young yet, got to live with relatives, and I'm glad for that. But my 3 sisters and I had to experience the foster home system, and they were all white foster homes in pretty much all white communities. Many times the other Indian kids that I would see were other foster kids, also in foster homes. And so what happens is we began to, because of a lot of the negative experiences and things that we hear that are said about us, or said about our people, said about other people, we have to really be careful. Like even today when I walk into a room, I kind of look around. And when I meet people, I read them. I want to see how they're reacting to me, how they're going to relate to me. If they're going to relate to me in a negative way, I might not want to deal with those folks. So we got to have those. That's part of our survival. So 7th grade, me and my sister end up in a foster home, and so as I walk into each class, the first thing I do is the first class I go to, I make contact with the teacher. And I want to see how that teacher looks at me. So I walk into the math class, my math class, and this teacher looks at me. And like I said, we have to learn to read people. Sometimes we have to read their eyes. And I saw his eyes, those stereotypes. Just another Indian kid. He don't want to be here. He's not going to stay. He's not going to stay here. So I thought, I said, I'm not going to like math. I'm not going to like a subject or a person that doesn't like me. And we don't all do that. I've met other Native people. They said when they experienced that, that just made them to try harder and be the best students they could. They wanted to show that person, no, I'm not like that. I'm not dumb. I'm not stupid. I'm not a savage. I'm smart too, just like everybody else. But pretty much after about a couple of years, away from my relatives, away from my community, can't see my grandparents, can't see my cousins, my aunts and uncles. I'm taking all these negative things in, and I can't excel. I just want to be accepted, I just want to make friends. And but I walk into my history class, and this older white woman is the history teacher. And when I walk in and I look at her, and she looks at me and she smiles. And I thought, oh, I'm going to like this class, because she's not looking at me. She's not judging me as an Indian kid. She's just looking at me as a regular student. So I loved history. I loved that class, because one of my gifts is a memory, good memory. So history, I thought, was just memorize time, dates, places, events, and people. And I could cram the night before and get an A or B on the test because of my memory. I could just pass the test real easy. So this is in 1961. So can you imagine the ignorance of people in this country in 1961 about us as Native people, and all the stereotypes and negative things that people believed about us? Well, there was 3 other Indian girls in the class, and we were situated according to our last name. So we weren't sitting together, but you know how kids are. We used to take these straws and chew on some paper and then spitballs. And so we were always getting hit in the back of the head with spitballs, or somebody would throw an eraser at us. We were kind of getting terrorized, But I still could, but I didn't care about that. I said, I like teachers, so I'm going to get A's here, A's or B's in this class. And so finally, after class one time, this one girl said, I don't want to come back here anymore. They said, I can't take it. I said, well, wait a minute now. I said, tell you what, I think the teacher likes me. So how about if I go ask her? And this is just before Thanksgiving vacation. I says, what if I go ask her if she can sit us over here in the corner? All 4 of us. So then we watch our backs. They can't do that to us. And they said, no, she's not going to do that. I said, well, let me try. So after class, just before Thanksgiving vacation, I went up to her and I said, Mrs. So-and-so, I said, I'm a good student, right? She said, oh yeah, John, you're a good student. You get good grades. I said, well, my 3 friends, they're not very good at taking notes. They have a hard time studying. I said, would you let us sit together? Would you set us over here in the corner? And then as I'm taking notes, they can watch. I didn't take notes, but I'm lying through my teeth. I'm just trying to survive, getting terrorized in this history class. And I said, so they could look at how I take notes, and I could help them with chapters to help them to get. And they said, "Oh, John," she says, you're such a nice boy." She said, "Okay." So after a Thanksgiving vacation, she did that. She said, "Oh man, we talk about pissed off boys in that class. Now they couldn't terrorize us anymore." So I thought, this is great, man. I didn't know I was doing organizing back when I was in 7th grade for survival. So then I thought, oh, this is cool. This is great. You know, I love this history class because I thought history was memorization. Didn't understand that really history, how we have to understand history and how it's not really being taught in the United States, even in 2020, is we shouldn't just learn times, dates, places, and people. But history should be taught in a way that, how does history tell us how relationships have been disrupted? These natural relationships that we talked about way back in the colonies, that as human beings, we just come together. We just come together as natural human beings. We like each other, see, don't matter what we look like. But what I began to understand later on is that really history should teach us. We should look at the essence of history and how history has either divided us or brought us together in relationships, human relationships. So we have to understand history from that perspective. So everything's going great, and then just before Christmas vacation, the half day just before Christmas vacation, she says, "Today, class, I want to read you one of the greatest documents of freedom ever written. Today, I'm going to read you the Declaration of Independence out loud. And I want you to listen to these words written by Thomas Jefferson, this beautiful document." So we're sitting there, and I hadn't read it before, and because I really didn't study or read the book, I just memorized. And so she starts reading. You know, when in course of human events it becomes necessary for this estab, blah, blah, blah. All men are created equal, blah, blah, blah. And then she gets to the part where Jefferson, and James Madison also had a hand, because he was a better writer than Jefferson. They began saying all the things why they're disbanding from England is because of all the things that the king is doing against the colonists, having standing armies. When they pass laws in the colonies, those laws being usurped by King George, taxing us without our consent. That's what, and then she gets to the part where Jefferson writes, and he has excited, talking about King George, and he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction to all sexes, ages, and conditions. And she takes a pause. Now, she doesn't read it like I'm saying it, but I'm hearing it like I'm saying it. And she takes a pause, and so now we're sitting over here in the corner, and all the kids turn to us, and you can just see it in their eyes. Yeah, I knew it. All you were nothing but savages, you know, you're nothing but savage. You know, that reinforcement through that educational system, through that history course, reinforces those images and those stereotypes about us as human beings. Very traumatic. That's why I still remember it today. I had a tough time the rest of the year. I really didn't like that history class. I didn't like that teacher. I now know she didn't do it on purpose, because she was socialized and conditioned to read out of a history book. But I'll never forget that. And a lot of it, after the class, I went back and I remembered a lot of things my mom taught me about how proud I should be, the beautiful culture, the beautiful spiritual societies that we were living for thousands of years. And I thought, I thought back later on in life, I said, I wish I could have stood up that day in class and defended our people, defended myself and these three friends of mine and our people. I wish I could have stood up in that history class and said, that's a lie. Thomas Jefferson is lying. We were not merciless Indian savages. We came from a beautiful, humanistic, spiritual culture of people. If we were the merciless Indian savages that Thomas Jefferson wrote about us, there never would have been a Jamestown. Powhatan Confederacy would have wiped out the English the minute they set the shores. There probably wouldn't have never been a United States of America if we were these merciless Indian savages that Jefferson put on us, termed on us as human beings. But I couldn't. By 12 years old, race prejudice had taken such a toll on me that I began to feel that I was inferior. Being a Chippewa, all of a sudden, I had no positive reinforcement in my life. Couldn't go to my white foster parents and tell them how I felt. They wouldn't understand. I knew that. They couldn't understand because they had never experienced that as white people, that kind of discrimination, that type of race prejudice. And so I had to internalize it. It's just somehow bury it inside of me and keep going, trying to develop as the best loving human being that my mom taught me I'm supposed to be living, or mino bimatisi wen, that good life, that good, respectful, loving, sharing, giving life that is our culture and our people, but I couldn't. I had taken a toll on me. I'll tell you, by the time I was 15 years old, ended up in another foster home, in another high school. I'll tell you what, I hate to admit this, I was ashamed of who I was. I felt one of my worst fears was somebody walked up to me and said, "Are you an Indian?" Unbelievable. The psychology that people of color sometimes have to go through, how they have to keep their identity, a positive identity intact, and especially if they got a reinforcement of a family, of a community. But if you don't got that, you can snap. You can commit suicide because it takes a toll on you. So we really have to understand racism and how a lot of our people go into every one of these systems. And who's ever sitting behind that desk, receptionist desk, if they got this in their head, that they've been socialized, conditioned by the power structures that reinforce images and stereotypes, that we get treated based on that race prejudice within every system in this country, bar none. And we have to deal with that. We somehow have to keep going forward and develop as the best positive, loving, respectful human being as we can. And it's very hard. And a lot of our, especially Native kids, can't. Even today, I'm just being honest. A lot of our kids still have a hard time coming to Cook County High School. And things they hear about people from Grand Portage, and those kids coming from Grand Portage, that a lot of them, through no fault of their own, it's not intentional. This is intentional. This is what keeps this. And white folks internalize stuff about black folks, about Native folks, about Asian folks, about Hispanics, people called Mexican, coming from South America, or Puerto Rico. They develop these, and so we got to really, and this is what is power. So what people say, well, what do we do away with all these systems and institutions? We say no, because what has developed out of that is a culture. What we're going to take, if it's all right, could we take about a 5-minute break? How about at 7:35, we'll go into, and what I want to talk about is forms of racism. How racism is kept in place individually, institutionally, and culturally in the United States of America. Because the thing is now talking about police, talking about institutional racism. But when you get hired as a policeman in the United States of America, if you're white, how then do you make sure that those people that get certified to be a law enforcement officer, carry a gun, enforce the law, how do you know for sure that they don't have race prejudice when they get certified as a police officer, certified as a teacher, certified as a social worker, certified as elected as a county attorney? How do we know, or how do they know, that they haven't internalized a race prejudice about black folks, native folks? I don't know. Hopefully, so what's happening is we're going to talk about that after a 5-minute break. At 7:35, we'll come back together. I got to take a drink of water. The record's active there now. So how's it going? Yes. Right clear? Okay, good.
And we'll still be rolling, so you know that it's still live. But I'm gonna move
Just
it.
let them look at that.
I'm gonna move the table out a little bit, so that when you walk out, it's still catchy here.
I just kind of wanted to look at that power of the house, process it.
I'm gonna move that toward the camera.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I haven't lost my train of thought too bad. Did a few times.
How's that ride?
What's the delay, I'll let you know.
Usually there's 3 people doing these pieces. Usually there's more than one person doing these pieces.
I think it's good.
Oh, good. That's,
You can see it better now.
forms of racism. Hour and a half. It'll take some, it'll be a good hour on the forms of racism. A little more history. Whew,
How you doing?
tired. Should have ate more.
Come back here and see who I'm sitting here. So you can look at my computer screen. So I'll move this up toward the camera more.
I can't really read that.
Yeah, it was pretty
Oh,
simple.
that's pretty simple.
So that's why I pushed it. So when you're talking, you can stand to the left of it. Just watch so that you don't go too far.
First trial.
Yeah.
Test.
Yeah, there you go.
Nervy for
We just have to get you back to more. There's one in front of
Good
that.
shot there.
Yeah, we will.
I think that last part that you just spoke about, kind of, joint powers group is watching kind of reinforces what I told him in that one meeting, what, even as a young child, making that trip from Grand Portage into Grand Marais, your whole world changed and you hit 10 miles south of Grand Portage. You know what? It sucked, but that's our life. We grew up with it, you know. We all grew up with it. Cool.
How does that look? Can you see that? Okay.
Yeah, someone made a comment.
What we'd like to talk about now is identify what we would call forms of racism and how does racism play out. How does racism play out individually, institutionally? That's what they talk about, institutional racism. Well, that's one aspect of racism. And then culturally, how does culturally racism play out? And you can see I got them there. They work together. Can't have the individual without a culture propping up an individual race prejudice or racism institutionally. And you can see that they work together. They flow together. So that when we talk about individual racism, we talk about how we, a lot of the stuff we talked about, how we internalize things, how white folks internalize things about Native folks and black folks and Asian folks and Hispanic folks. But what's real insidious is that we're also internalizing negative things about ourselves. Native people internalize negative things about themselves. But we also internalize negative things about black folks. Black folks internalize negative things about white folks. White folks internalize negative things about Asian folks. Asian folks internalize things even about Native folks. So you see what happens, how this plays out, is we all these messages that are sent out by these institutions. We say that for individuals in the United States, and in fact those who are classified as white, they send out positive messages. These are all for you. Whatever, you know, you're welcome. You have legal act, they're sanctioned by the authority of the state. And for other folks, the way they operate, how they've been operating from day one, is they send out negative messages. Like I talked about the Westerns that I would see talking about our people. I always ask the question, where are our people in commercials? All the other races you see in commercials. And somebody will raise their hand and work, what about that Indian man that was along the highway during that litter commercial. Man by the name of Iron Eyes Cody had the braids. Look, and we have to say, He was from Sicily. He was like the other Italians that were portrayed in a lot of the westerns. They used Italian people because Italian people had a little bit of color. See, even a lot of people from Europe. That's why we had to cross out skin color, because a lot of people of Europe, they're not all the same color either. They come in different shades. And so we began to internalize all these negative messages. So individually, we all internalize things as individuals, the stereotypes, the negative messages that this power system, power structure puts out at us every day of our life. So where are we in commercials? How come you don't see a native man and a native woman with some native children? I mean, you know, you look at them and you can see they're native, and selling toothpaste. Does Graham Greene or West Studi or Tantu Cardinal, do they get a call from these various systems, retail systems, selling stuff on it? Do they get a call and say, hey, would you like to be in a commercial? Yeah, we're going to pay you to be in a commercial. And guess what? You don't have to play an Indian, but just be yourselves. We're the only ones that aren't in commercials. In fact, after I went to my first workshop in 1987, a couple of years later, I was sitting at my friend's house watching TV, and we had both went to the workshop 2 years earlier. And in fact, we had brought workshops to White Earth, a couple of them. And we had went to the first national workshop that they had. If you went to a workshop, then you could go to the national training that was held every year. And so we were really learning about racism. And so a commercial came on. And the commercial was this Indian man and this Indian woman riding through like the desert of New Mexico or Arizona. And they were on white horses and riding. And you could see them. And I sat there and I turned to my friend and I said, man, that looks pretty positive. Usually you don't see Indian people. I've never seen Indian in a commercial. What's happening? That's really positive. And so you could see them coming closer on those horses, closer. And just as they were getting into view, all of a sudden these men in camouflage came down on these ropes, hit the ground, and here it was, United States Army commercial. So what's happening? What's the image there? Who were these guys? The Army commercial. And where were they coming from? They were coming from helicopters. And what are the names of all these helicopters, these weapons of mass destruction that are used in war? What are they usually called? The Apache, the Chickasaw, the Seminole, named after Indian tribes. All these helicopters, these weapons of mass destruction. So you see what's happening in that commercial? They're perpetuating, keeping that negative images about Indian. They're warlike. Got to watch out for them. That's why we put them on reservations. We still got reservations about those folks. Images that are put out and live. And we internalize that as individuals. So white folks began to internalize that. And so they began to think that we made it. How come those Indians can't make it? How come they're so poor? How come they can't keep a job? How come, or those black folks, we made it. Well, of course, when everything is set up for you, maybe not all to the same degree. All white folks don't get the benefit because of the class system in this country. But we don't get those same privileges. We don't get that same. We don't have that same positive relationship with these institutions and systems. And but individually, I'm not talking about all individuals, but you began to internalize this stuff as an individual, and to different degrees. So you got the KKK. They've been around since 1865. They started right after when Reconstruction started in the South. They understood this power structure, and they wanted to keep this in place. They wanted to make sure those Negroes in the South didn't have the same privilege and advantage we do, because this wasn't made for them. This was not meant for them. 1865, and they're still an organization. Not the American Indian movement, not the Black Panthers, not the Chicano movement. They were all infiltrated by the FBI, and they've been wiped out. Still got AIM today, but it's not the organization that it initially was, and a lot of the things they did because of the infiltration by the FBI and the dismantling of these organizations. But there's but the neo-Nazis, they're alive and well in this country. And so they act out racism individually because of superiority that these institutions and systems send out. We're going to treat you better. And they do than those other folks. But an individual racism has to be backed up by an institution. And so, like we said before, the way curriculum has been developed in the United States, we don't get no credit for nothing. Black folks don't get no credit for nothing other than the free labor that developed a capitalistic economy and the free land they stole from us that created this whole country. We don't learn about that in history. Although we're lucky here in Cook County because we have an Indian history class now that's being taught at the high school. So what we're talking about is institutions. This is institutional racism that backs up that individual race prejudice. So that when we talked about the definition of race, that all of the curriculum, who gets credit for all of the curriculum, the sciences, hell, we had astronomers, we could tell, we had weather people, we had mathematicians. I mean, we weren't stupid. We had to count things. We had systems. You know, when you look at history, in 500 AD, the Mayans were the first people to use the zero as a base system in mathematics. That wouldn't come about in Europe till, I don't know, the 11th, 12th century, where people from Europe, mathematicians, would use that and understand that as a base system. When you look at the Mayan history too, they had 9 mounds in their society. Those 9 mounds stood for the 9 planets. No, they had 10. And they stood for the planets in the universe. 500 AD, they understood the solar system, where you had, it took people from Europe till Copernicus, Ptolemy, Galileo. I mean, these are people, what, in the 11th, 12th century. So, but we don't get credit. They don't teach that in the educational systems in this country. It's like it never happened. Don't get credit, so all the credit is given, and the institution backs this up. Every one of these. The institution of education backs that up, backs up that race prejudice because it's embedded. You know, when a teacher becomes a teacher, you go to the educational department within a university. Now they offer classes in other histories like American Indian Studies, African American Studies, but they're not required. You don't have to take them to become a teacher in this country. It's an elective. It's not part of the core curriculum. So wouldn't that be a lot better if people who become teachers get educated and they have to take an American Indian Studies course, they have to take an African American Studies course, they have to take an Asian Studies course, they have to take all these courses to make them, to give them a full understanding of because they might end up on a reservation, they might end up in the ghetto teaching black kids, and they have no clue about their history or their culture. And that was one of the things that Ron Chisholm and Jim Dunn, who developed the People's Institute some 40 years ago, they had gone to a whole bunch of trainings to be, they were both community organizers. And when they finally met in New York, they met at a place in New York City called the God Box. And they call it the God Box because every religious institution, every religion in the world is in there. And in the 60s and 70s, that was the place where a lot of people went when they were doing community organizing in their communities. They could go there and get money because the churches were handing out money for organizing in your communities, communities of color. So they met there. And they began talking about their organizing experience. And it finally dawned on them. They said, you know, of all the training I've been to, they never talk about culture, never talk about history, and they never talk about race or racism. And they were beginning to learn that when we go into our communities and try to organize and make things better and more positive, that if we don't understand the history of a community, if we don't understand the culture of a community, and if we don't understand the effect that racism has had on these communities, and we don't hear that in our training, then we're being trained to become skillful racists. We just buy into this. So that's how the institutional racism keeps backing up individuals. We had sometimes we were in a workshop one time and we were going through this, and one of the white person in a training raised their hand. Oh, we gave a story about, let's say, you go up to you go check out at Walmart or Target, and you're a white person, and the person is rude to you. You know, doesn't treat you very good. So what can you do? So you got the power to call the man. Say, I want to talk to the manager. I want to talk to the manager about the way you're treating me. That's not right. So the manager comes and sees the two people, the white cashier and the white person, and in all probability, that cashier will get a reprimand. Okay, and next in line is me. And I walk up to pay, I'm not lying, at some other time, I walk up and try and pay for something, and this woman treats me rude. So I call the manager. I say, I want to talk to the manager. I don't like the way you're treating me. So the manager comes and sees me, a native person, and the cashier, a white person. Now, that white person has that race prejudice in them. I know that. By the way, they're treating me because of how they've been socialized and conditioned to think about Indian people. I'm not stupid anymore. I understand that's what's happening. So when that manager comes, who is he going to believe? Is that manager going to believe the cashier or me? Because I gotta know if that manager has race prejudice about Indians too. So that's the dynamic, and we had to explain. A white person, well, I get treated really. Didn't quite understand the distinction between race and racism, but was still struggling with that, and that's what happens in the workshop process. People have a hard time. This is hard to process sometimes. It's hard to believe it if it's really happening, but hopefully it's giving us a better idea of what we're up against, or what has been done here in the United States. Because if we don't understand what has been done, we can't undo nothing. And I think that's what has happened in this country. People really don't have a clue or a really truthful historical understanding about how racism came about and how it's being kept in place, how race is being kept in place. So institutions will back up individual race prejudice. But in order for individual and institutional racism to be kept, there has to be a culture nourishing and supporting individual racism, institutional racism. So there's a culture. And in the United States, what is that culture called? Wait for a response. Anybody tell me what is the culture here in the United States? How these systems and institutions operate. From what culture? What do they call that? White culture. That's the culture that has been created. And within that is embedded the race prejudice. So that we got some things called, so how culture, and what a culture is defined as imposing a dominant culture on a people and oppressing them and imposing another culture. Well, the history of Native people in this country, all we have to do is go back and look at the assimilation policies that were put in place to assimilate us. The stories my mom would tell me about what happened to her at Pipestone boarding school. My dad could never talk about his experiences up at the Red Lake Indian Mission, St. Mary's Indian Mission on the Red Lake Reservation. Brought all the way at 6 years old from Red Cliff in Wisconsin. My mother brought here from Chippewa City down to Pipestone, Minnesota to a boarding school. All of the terrible stories she would tell me, and I just make me cry as a young child. I couldn't believe it. I'd ask her, why did they treat kids like that? She said, because they were trying to change us. They were trying to turn us into another kind of people. And they said a lot of kids resisted. They paid the consequences in those boarding schools. So there has to be a culture that nurtures individual institutions. And so shoots of cultural racism is linguistic. How does, through the English language, is racism kept in place? Militarism, we call that the martial enforcement of racism through militarism. We see that a perfect example is the civil rights movement. How they're on alert, National Guards, local police forces. It's even happening now. We see how they respond to the Black Lives Matter protests. I mean, these are the enemy of the country, the way, look, we call that the martial enforcement of racism, we call that militarism. Linguistic racism, how through the English language, stereotypes are kept in place. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Healthcare racism. We know that there's better outcomes in healthcare, in hospitals, how people are treated. My dad ended up in a hospital in Ashland, Wisconsin, and very strong mind. My dad had a very strong mind, very, very, very smart man. Well, anyways, they sedated him because he wouldn't stay in bed. So they sedated him, and they thought they sedated him enough. But in the middle of the night, my dad tried to get up. He fell out of bed. And so I got a call up in Grand Portage, and they called me and said, we just want to tell you, Mr. Morrin, your father fell out of bed last night. And I said, well, how is he? He's all right. Yeah, don't worry. We're taking care of him. I said, okay. So next day I took off. I drove down to Ashland to see my dad, to see how he was. And I got to the hospital, and I went up to the desk, and I said, which room is Mr. Morrin in? And they said, oh, he's not here. And I said, what do you mean he's not here? He just called me last night and said he fell. Oh, we transferred him to Duluth to St. Mary's. Okay. So I jumped in my car and drove over to Duluth to St. Mary's Hospital. And I walked into his room, and he was laying in bed, and I said, what happened, Dad? He said, are you all right? He said, I'm okay. I'm okay. I said, okay. So we're sitting there talking. And then he kind of must have been uncomfortable. He tried to shift in his bed, and all of a sudden he winced. I said, Dad, what's wrong? So I said, it was in my back. I said, let me look at it. So I went over and looked at his back. It was black and blue. I mean, it was like about that, on black and blue. I said, Dad, I said, what happened? And he said, oh, they took me down to X-ray. He said, I broke some ribs. So what they did is and I said, well, did they take an X-ray over in Ashland? He said, no, they just, next day, they just brought me over here to St. Mary's. And at St. Mary's, they finally took X-rays. So this man's got broken ribs, transferred him over to another hospital. I was so angry. I was really trying to control myself. I was going to go down to that. I was going to find somebody, a doctor or something. And then I said, oh, no, wait a minute here. So I said, Dad, I said, we got to do something about this. I said, I know this attorney that we can get, civil attorney. I think I can get him to take us on a contingency fee that we don't have to pay money, that whatever award we get from the lawsuit. I said, because we got to sue Ashland Hospital. You can't. They're going to treat other Native people like that, you know, like they don't matter. And I said, so we got to stop that. You know, and here I am, all my racism training. And so he didn't want to do it at first. And I just kept fighting. He said, okay. So then I did. I left and I went and found this attorney in Minneapolis, got him to take the case. So I went back to my dad. By this time, he was at home. I said, Dad, I got an attorney. I said, so you still want to sue Ashland Hospital? And he said, no. Well, I tried to talk him into it, but he wouldn't. Why wouldn't he? Why wouldn't my dad want to sue Ashland Hospital? He might end up there again, because they're not going to take him from Red Cliff over to Duluth. They're going to take him to the nearest hospital, which is Ashland. And so what happens causes fear in us as people of color about the relationship and how we're treated by these institutions and systems. Now he was afraid. He was afraid he might end up there and get treated the same. But, you know, so he had never been to a workshop, so he didn't have a full analysis, although I'd go there many times and talk to him about the work I was doing and what I was learning, and he was kind of understanding it. And I said, Dad, do you know, you used to tell us that you're going to get a house. And he said, I tried. We were living in South Minneapolis. He said, I tried. I went down to the Veterans Affairs and gave him my discharge papers. And man, he fought in World War II. He was in the Navy. His ship got bombed, had to be towed back to Pearl Harbor. I think half the men on his ship got killed. There were 1,500 men, but he survived. He made it back to Hawaii. And so after I was in a workshop and I learned something that I didn't know before. I learned that before the GI Bill would be passed by the Southern politicians, now this is in 1944, so what do they got to keep in place in the South, Alabama, Georgia? They got to keep segregation in place. And so the Southern politicians would not vote for the veterans housing bill unless there was a rider attached to it. So when the man that we were living in, he was from White Earth, but he was very light complected. So when he went down to get his loan for a $200 down and 30-year mortgage, he passed. But when my dad went down there, who was a little darker, right away they said, well, oh yeah, Mr. Morrin, yes, we see everything's in place. We'll give you a home, but you got to go back to Red Cliff. My dad didn't want to go back to Red Cliff. He had a job at the Veterans Hospital, a good federal job that he had gotten. Back in Red Cliff was extreme poverty, no jobs, just like there was on every other reservation in the United States at that time, because of racism. So he wasn't going to go back there and raise a family. He wanted a house in South Minneapolis, but he couldn't get it. And I think all his life he felt bad that he couldn't get that GI loan for the house. And when I learned about that rider attached to the GI housing bill, I went to visit him about a week later. I went to visit him. We were sitting in his living room. I said, Dad, do you remember when you used to tell me that you were going to go down and get a loan to get a house and we were going to have a house and you never got that? He said, yeah. I said, do you know why? I said, no. And I told him about that rider on the GI housing bill. That's why they told you to go back to Red Cliff, because they wanted to keep you segregated. Because the GI housing bills under that rider said that they would give loans to people of color only if they lived among themselves. Only if you lived in a neighborhood where other black folks, other Indian folks, other Asian folks, or even though all these people fought in the war. I mean, there was, when they finally let black folks serve in 1944, they had something called the Red Brigade. And so African American men were taken over Germany, and they had to parachute out of the planes with dynamite charges, bombs. So can you imagine falling from an airplane with a parachute, and you got all, you know, I think some of them blew up when they hit the ground, depending on how they hit the ground. Asian people, they are, other than Native people, they are some of the most decorated people, those Asian people that fought in World War II, but yet the GI housing bill wanted to keep that segregate, wanted to keep people in the ghetto, keep people in the barrio, keep people on the reservation, keep people in Chinatown. That's what that, so, and I remember telling him about that, and I never forget in his eyes, probably for the first time, he understood what happened to him, and that it wasn't his fault. Because see, what happens is, the power of these we began to think it's our fault. You know, I thought, you know, race prejudice, I'm an Indian, this is my life. I gotta live like, I gotta tolerate that the rest of my life. You know, the damn thing I can do, I can maybe fight, but no, once we start attacking this construct, these institutions come into play. And they deal with those people like we did when we try to come out of that box, these institutions and systems put us back in there. They keep us. This is what they're trying to protect. And they're trying to protect us for those people classified as white in this country. And so all that dynamic, so cultural and healthcare, so there's racism within the healthcare system in this country. Environmental. I always give the example of Prairie Island. In the late 30s, they built a nuclear plant 650 yards from their community. To this day, there was only one road into the Prairie Island, one road out. What if that nuclear plant had leaked? They were 650 yards from that community. As far as we know, in the United States, that's the closest nuclear plant to any community in this country. It's next to a Native community. And the cancer rate is really high because of the effects of that nuclear plant there. So there's environmental reasons, and we know what's going on in this country with the climate change, how the government, that's another one we didn't put up here, government, all of them, federal, state, county, are part of this power structure. How they're not dealing with climate change today when this planet is almost being eaten up. Economic racism. So these are different aspects or offshoots of the culture, white culture that's developed in this country, that all white culture does is keep institutions, and then those messages that institutions send out that individuals internalize about each other. And in fact, we even internalize stuff about ourselves, people of color. So we fight each other too. We call it ethnocentrism, where people of color are against each other. That's what this whole construct does. It creates so that if we keep us fighting each other, killing each other, then this construct is safe. It's kept intact. And we're not saying that we have to do away with this. What we're saying is that every institution in this country, there has to be a transformation. of how they operate. Do away with that biased way of how they perpetuate race prejudice, every institution. And that what they got to do is transform and be inviting to all of our cultures, so that when we go into these institutions that we're treated equal. We're treated equal, but yet that's not possible because these institutions and systems operate in an inequitable way. See, they passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964, made things equal by law, but it didn't change the way these institutions operate from a race bias perspective. That didn't change. You can pass all the laws you want. Right? Even like in discrimination, we could usually go to the court system and all we had to do is prove intent. The intent of how we were treated or how we were related to, but then that changed with the conservative court being put in place over the years through many administrations, conservative administrations. It did not create equity. This construct, this system, this power arrangement does not operate in an equitable way. Therefore, you have racial inequity. And by equity, what do we mean? Fair. We all can go into these institutions, but we all don't get treated the same way or in a fair way. And so going to Kmart. I went to Walmart a few years ago, and with a couple of friends, and they went off to go shopping. And I go back to the CDs and the movies, DVDs, looking for a good historical movie or look for a good CD. So I'm back there and I'm going through looking through the CDs, and I see somebody walking by. Like I said, now we have, not paranoid, but I looked up. And I could see it was a floor walker because you got the blue shirt, you got the name tag. So I knew it was a Walmart floor walker. So I continued going through that. Then all of a sudden I sense somebody over here to my left. So I look over and there's that guy. There's that floor walker. Like he's going through the CDs. Bang. He's profiling me. I'm being profiled. I got profiled the minute I walked into Walmart. And how do we know that? Over the years, they've hired people of color. Because see, they got people up there with all those cameras that sit up there and watch the floor. They hired people of color up there. And people of color were told to watch other people of color when they came in. You see a black person come in, you see an Indian person, an Asian person. You see them come in, you call down and have somebody watch them. That's what was happening to me. I was being profiled because of who I was perceived to be by this construct, an American Indian. So I walked in there to steal, to rob. That's the stereotype that's running through, that's the bias in these institutions. But we know that, and they have codes that they use when they're following people. So I knew he was followed, so then I looked over and he was gone. So I picked up a CD, and I was going to go down around to another section, and as I turned and I was walking, all of a sudden I heard, "Can I help you?" And I turned around and there was that man standing there. See, and I had that CD in my hand, so now he's going to approach me and talk to me. And I said, no, not at this time. I'm going to look at some other CDs. I said, but I know you're profiling me, but I understand why. You should have seen the look on that man's face. His eyes got big, he looked at me, and all I wanted to do was engage him into some conversation. I wanted to educate this, just one floor walker in Walmart. I wanted him to know how he's being used by the retail system called Walmart. And as I walked over to him, he turned and he walked away. He didn't want to engage me. But I said it in a good way, but we try to deal with that. It's like, I was doing a workshop in Chicago, and the waiter came. I went down for breakfast at the hotel I was staying at, and the man coming, the waiter, I could see he wasn't African American, but he was, black, but I could see he was from another country. I can tell the difference, So he came up, took my order, brought my food, and then he came back to get the check. And so he picked up, when I was paying for the breakfast, and before he turned, he said, "Thanks, Chief." A teaching moment. And so we let him walk away. And then when he came back and brought my change, I said to him, "What did you say before you left?" He said, "Chief." I said, "I called you Chief." He said, "I respect your people." And I said, "I know you do. I could hear that in your voice, that you did say it out of respect." I said, "But I want to tell you something." And I told him why I was there in Chicago in the workshop we were doing. He said, "I just want to tell you something because I don't want you to get hurt." And he looked at me. "Oh, what is this guy asking me?" I said that word chief. I said, "I know you used it in a respectful way, but I know many times that's used in a derogatory way toward Indian men." And I said, in our culture, not everybody was a chief. Not everybody was called a chief. In fact, there were Ogema, there were leaders, and they were picked by the people because their respect, their knowledge, their whatever. They were there to serve the people. It was an honor to be a leader, or be a chief, what they call them. I said, so you just can't, that would offend some people. And I said, I just wanted to tell you that because I understand. I could tell by your voice, and I understand that. But I said, you might walk up, you might meet another native man someday that has a lot of the anger. I got a lot of anger in me, but I know how to control it. But they might have a lot of anger in them and understand how that word chief has been used, not for them or other people. And he said, he could hit you. His response could be to hit you. I said, that's why I'm telling you this. And before he walked away, he said, thank you. He said, I'll never call another native man chief again. So little things you can do like that. Little things, just little, we're not going to, I believe you might not even do, I believe I might even do away with this in our lifetime, my lifetime. But if we continue to do the work, like what we're doing tonight, give people an understanding, information, knowledge about what we're all up against, maybe our next generation, maybe our kids, me and Bobby's kids, will grow up and be able to change this like it should be, to make it equitable, not just equal, but equitable, that they function in an equitable way. So that's the culture. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about this linguistic racism. Back up. Oh, okay. So, linguistic racism. One of our trainers developed this piece, and after research, in fact, Malcolm X. Many of you people know who Malcolm X was. Whatever you think, good or bad, just read the autobiography of Malcolm X, and you'll get a whole different light of how he changed and how he began. So, anyways. This friend of mine, Dan Buford, who was a trainer with the Institute, he was looking through one of Malcolm X's books about him. and he had seen it before, but for the first time he took a look at this picture. And this picture that of Malcolm X, he was looking at a chalkboard and he had on there written Negro / Niger / Negros equals corpse. So he was looking at that, he says, what is Malcolm up to here? And so what Malcolm was talking about was linguistic racism. And so Dan, after his research and developing this piece, he would say, before the piece, he would say, if you don't understand the English language, you don't know if people are talking positive about you or not. So you better understand the English language and words and phrases and the connotation of English words that are created. So we began to learn that the NE on Negro, the NI on Niger, and the NE, because probably 90% or more of the words in the English language are derived from Greek and Latin. And a lot of the European languages, the Italian, the French, German, they all eventually, as languages develop, and you get down to 90% of the words come from Latin or Greek. So he was looking at that and he began to learn to do more research. And he says lexicographers, those are people who create words in the English language and define them. Over time, the NE and the NI become interchangeable. Now this is what you call the connotation of a word, the root, which then is the meaning. What is the meaning of that word? And so he'll learn that lexicographers say these can be interchangeable and mean the same thing. And so he looked at NE and Niger in Latin, that's the word. Now we said negro is Spanish for black. Niger is Latin for the color black. Well, you can create another word, just add another G to it. And you create another word that's put on human beings. What does necros mean? Does anybody know what necros means? Anybody take any Greek? Necros in Greek means death. So remember when we went back, Negroid? How did they, that's what he was talking about, Negro. They took away the humanity. They were like dead people. They weren't even humans. They were dead. All their history and culture was wiped out just by this one word. And how assimilated we can become. I was just kind of, I guess I understood, but a lot of older black folks, they had taken it out of the dictionary because of people protesting it and then beginning to understand what the word is really saying. And they went to some older black folks in the South, and they convinced those black folks to agree that it should be put back in the dictionary. That's, you know, how this racism works on us, even as people of color, and how it can assimilate our thinking and tolerate words. So that's why he said it means corpse. We're Negro. So let's say a master on a plantation has forced relations with a Negro slave, and they have an offspring. So what would that offspring be called? An offspring between half black and half white. That would be the master's white and the African slave is black. What would they call that offspring? Does anybody know? That's where the word mulatto comes from. Somebody answered that? Good, good. So, And we know that was way back in the colonies when this word came about. So what are they saying about a person, a human being, that is half black and half white, and they call them a mulatto? Well, we have to go back to the beginning of the word, the connotation, and the meaning, and we go back and we find mu. And then through research, we find in Latin there's another word, mulus. And so there's another English word that's created out of this Latin word, mulus. They'll create another English word for an animal, a mule. So a mule is what? Half horse and half donkey. Jackass. Donkey. And they're two different species, right? They shouldn't be mating. They shouldn't be having... so what happens when they produce a mule? What's the problem with the mule? Mulus means sterile in Latin. So the implication is somehow this offspring, half black, half white, is sterile.
Somebody got that too.
Great. So, let's say the master rapes a mulatto slave, and they have an offspring. What do they call that? Human. I'll wait a few minutes. Some people are out there pretty good. So what would they call, and that would be, okay.
Quadroon?
Very good, very good. Oh, good, we got some. Quadroon, which would be a quarter black and 3/4 white. See what's happening by that word? It's keeping that superiority, that humanity in place. Okay, so the master has forced relations with a quadroon, and they produce an offspring. So what would that offspring be called? I know somebody will get it, they're on a roll. Remember, we're in Latin language.
Octoroon.
Very good. Thank you. Octoroon. Or however you spell it. I don't know. Such a crazy word, I don't even know how to spell it. Octoroon, which is 1/8. What they'll say is 1/8 black and 7/8 white. Again, the word itself keeps that superiority of white as more human than the octoroon. So, how about the word, what does it mean? What does a noun mean, Jew? What does it mean to be a Jew as a noun?
Cheap.
As a noun? That's
Of the Hebrew religion,
yes, yes.
practicing Judaism.
Yep. That's a Jew as a noun. So now, what is it as a verb, or how is it used in reference to a verb? Somebody said it.
To cheat
To cheat,
someone.
take advantage.
Cheat.
Yes. So you see how those words they can be used into, and we still have there's still this stuff going on about Jewish people in the world, conspiracy theories and all that. So, what does it mean to gyp somebody? Gyp somebody.
Steal.
Steal. So, who were the gypsies? Where did the gypsies come from? Or where did they go?
Romus.
Romus? Rome?
Romania.
Yeah, that's where they went. They went all over Europe. They went to Spain.
India.
That's where they went. They went to Spain. They brought the flamenco dance. They brought the guitar. They brought a lot of culture into Europe. But were they treated well? Were they treated in a positive way, gypsies? No, they weren't. So where the heck did they come from? We know where they went, but what's their origin? Egypt. They came from Egypt. They came from Africa. Maybe that's why they weren't treated so nice up there in Europe. I don't know. Just guessing. So, let's say if, well, we all know. We know the definition of savage. It's what we were called. Well, let's look at some words like, what does it mean to be what does it mean to be germane? What's the definition of germane?
Relevant.
Appropriate. Right on. So what's the root of germane? Oh, wow. That's a positive word. You even got a positive folks in there. Or what's a franc? Even though now called a euro, but what was originally a franc? Well, I know people saying it's a French dollar, right? Or what is a franchise? I'm going to guess at this. What's a franchise? Is a franchise something positive? Darn right it is. Who's that guy? Red, the guy that bought the Vikings, remember, for 200 million? Red.
Coin.
Huh?
Coin.
Yeah, it's a coin, but you see franc, and even though it's a French word, but in English, when the word France is an English word, it's not a French word, it's an English word, you see the root of it.
Moneymaker.
Yeah, but the idea is, you see how positive it is? Or a franchise. That was like red. Anyways, this guy bought the Vikings back in a long time, quite a few years ago. Bought the Vikings for 200 million. Bought the Viking franchise for 200 million. And a few years later, he sold it for 600 million. Wow, that's pretty positive. That's pretty good. But again, look, it's built in there as something, a word that talks positive about some place or some people. So it's really important to look at words, how they're formed, how they're used, and that's why, what are they saying about people? So let's take a look at a word, European. Is it O-N or A-N? How about it? European. What's the root of European? Or I should ask, what does it mean to be euphoric? Oh yeah, red combs. So, what does it mean to be euphoric?
Very happy.
Very happy. How about, I've been asked at times when relatives die or a friend dies, I'll give a eulogy. So, what do you do in a eulogy? You don't talk bad about the person, what they did in life. You talk about all the good things the person did in life. So when we look at the root or the connotation from European, we have to go back to the beginning as EU, which euphoric comes from Greek. So those are the roots of euphoric, eulogy, which are very positive. And so when we talk about Europeans, the root of the word and the meaning of the word is positive. And look back in history, all the positive things European digs, and so it's really important how words are developed. So if I was to say, the only good Indian is, somebody's got to know that. The only good Indian is, ten, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. There's a phrase that
I don't want to say it, but it's dead.
Yes, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. And that's not, we know them. See, we got to begin acknowledging. We got to be able to say things and then talk about them. What are they really saying? And then there's history. You got to understand the history of words. So where did that phrase come from? See if anybody knows how that phrase came about in history. That might be a little bit more difficult unless they read it.
Jackson?
No. That's good.
Roosevelt?
No. Teddy? Are they talking about? Yeah. But no.
The question is pre-Jackson? Before Jackson? Is it before Jackson?
It's after.
After?
It's after the Civil War. When they stopped fighting each other.
Sherman?
Very good. Philip Sherman, thank you. Somebody out there knows their history. Philip Sherman came back from an Indian massacre. I can't remember what tribe, what people he massacred, but he came back, and a reporter ran up to him and said, General Sheridan, have you ever seen a good Indian? And it was Philip Sheridan that would say, The only good Indian I ever saw was a dead one. That's where that phrase comes from. So, but we all know it. We know that. I've been in workshops and guys, 5, 10 people they can spit it out. It's in us. If I was to say, he doesn't stand a Chinaman's chance in hell, where does that phrase come from?
Railroad?
Very good. As when the Chinese were immigrated to Hawaii, which the Japanese already were occupying too, and they were persecuted by the Japanese, and they've been fighting for a while. And so they left and they went to what came to the west coast of the United States. And just as Europeans would go through a place in New York called Ellis Island, Chinese people would have to go through a place on an island outside of San Francisco called Blue Island. And that's there where they were, and then they were allowed to come onto the mainland from, Angel Island, I'm sorry. Angel Island is where they were processed, and then they were allowed to come onto the west coast. And they were given 5 jobs. Chinese people were, initially, before the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, they were given 5 jobs. Do you know what those 5 jobs were? They were limited to 5 jobs. That might be a hard one, unless they've studied Asian history.
Laundry?
Yes, that was one.
Mining?
No.
Cooking?
Yes. They had restaurants. That's true. That's really good.
Shoe shine?
Possibly, if that falls into as domestics.
Demolitions?
No. We have to do your laundry. They could have laundry, wash laundry for people. They could feed you. Chinese restaurants. They could work. They could clean your houses as domestics. And there were 2 more they were allowed. That's kind of hard. They ran the brothels. And what was the last one they were allowed to?
Childcare?
No. So they did laundry, fed you, cleaned your
Railroad?
house.
It's a railroad?
We're going to get to that. That was later on. But initially, the five jobs: laundry, food, domestics, brothels. They ran the opium dens. They brought opium. Of course, they didn't abuse it, but Americans, when they started, they'd go into this. So those are the initial 5. And then, when they began construction on the Transcontinental Railroad, they came from the East Coast, and they started from the West Coast, and they ended up in like Utah, Promontory, something point. Well, they were used as conscript Chinese men, and to help build the Transcontinental Railroad from California to Utah. And sometimes they'd run into a mountain, and the barons, who were putting all the money toward this, didn't want to spend the money to go around the mountain, so they began tunneling through the mountain. And then the job of the Chinese men was to go into the tunnels of the mountain, set dynamite charges, and hopefully they chose the fastest runners, because then after they set the dynamite charge, they had to run out. Well, some of them didn't make it. Or what they would do is they would lower Chinese men in a basket from the top of a mountain with dynamite charges, and they'd set the dynamite charges, light it, and pray that the person up above would pull them up fast enough. But a lot of them got blown out of the air. Therefore, a phrase comes about that he doesn't stand a Chinaman's chance in hell. That's the history of that phrase. It's talking about killing people. But I know some people know it. And people in the South one time, another trainer in our group would learn that when people would come out of church on Sunday down in the South, and they would say, well, I'll see you next Sunday, the Lord willing, and if the creeks don't rise. Are they talking about the weather? See you next Sunday, the Lord willing, and if the creeks don't rise. Oh, they were talking about the Creek Indian tribe. That's what they were talking about. Yeah, so phrases and words that we've heard, all of us might not remember them, but a lot of us remember. We learned these, and they're still used today. I've heard them used on TV, and this is another one that irks me. You hear this, and I'm an MSNBC groupie, I guess I watch it all. But they'll use this word tribal. Now, do they use that in a positive way when they talk about tribalism or tribal? Yeah. It's talked about it when things are messed up or things are going back. They say, oh, they're tribal. Huh? Just the word itself and keeps that negative connotation about Indian tribes. So, words and phrases, we got to understand them. And therefore, if they're talking about some people in a positive way, or are they talking about other people in a negative way? We gotta understand the language and because these words. So here, that word, that no humanity to nigger, because it comes from the word Niger, which is the color black in Latin. But it created another word, another noun that is used quite often here in the United States towards certain human beings that were brought here in chains. They didn't come here gladly. So, are there any, this will kind of wrap it up. So it's kind of an introduction now. My hope is that, of course, after the pandemic hit, the People's Institute quit doing workshops, to get, in person. They couldn't because of the pandemic, especially the one going all over the country, and so they stopped doing them, but they were getting so many requests to do the workshops around the country that over the last 2 months, they developed a workshop process like we're doing here through Zoom. And so my hope is that I've just given you a few pieces of the 2.5-day, sometimes 3-day workshop process, just to kind of give you an introduction. But there's more that can help us understand about racism and how it works here in the United States. So my hope is that some people will come together, and I certainly would help. I would be there too to help coordinate, because I've coordinated the various workshops in the past, and come together and see maybe someday if we can bring another workshop here to Cook County through Zoom technology. Doesn't always work, right? So are there any, it's about almost 10 to 9, are there any other questions that people might have before we close tonight? And or any feedback?
Is there hope for the children? Is a question and then a comment. Thanks very much for sharing your knowledge with us.
My hope comes from the children, because they've done this with teenagers. There's another aspect of the People's Institute, they call it the youth agenda. And they actually do these workshops with young kids, and they get it. They get it. It isn't a struggle for them. So my hope comes from hopefully the next generation. If we continue doing this type of work, learning, understanding, and we pass this on to our children and reteach them the things that they're learning that aren't correct, I have hope. I wouldn't be able to do this work if I didn't have hope. So I have a lot of hope.
So another question, what can we do right now to start? And a lot of thank yous.
Well, come together and we can continue a discussion about experiences, people acknowledging their experiences here in Cook County, what they're experiencing now. What we hope is that it kind of opens people's eyes. A lot of time people go through this workshop process and they say, it's like I got a whole new set of lenses. He said, because racism has become normal in this country. I mean, a lot of the things we talked about, those are normal, those everyday occurrences. But now we see what's been done. And it's only then through an understanding and knowledge of what has been done here in the United States that we can begin to work and organize around undoing it. So that's my hope, is that we come together and keep this discussion going for those who are willing, because it's hard work. This is hard, this is not easy work because of what has happened to a lot of us and with our thinking and our experiences and how this construct keeps pitting us against each other with all this craziness that we hear every day. That's the power. And so we just continue the discussion and start doing the work here in Cook County, because there's a lot of work to do.
Bobby Duchat says, as tribal chairman, I will do all I can with John to keep this going.
All
Thanks,
right.
Al.
All right.
We'll do.
So tonight I say miigwech, thank you. Miu. That's all for tonight. So thank all of you for taking the time over 4 hours to sit and listen to all this. So I thank you, really thank you.